Cinderella Sarah. Sarah is an executive in her late 50s. Her parents were affluent. Her father started his own business when she was quite young. When we interviewed her, Sarah was extremely candid about her relationship with her papa and sister. Sarah's father was a very strong-willed individual. His views about the role of women in our society were at odds with Sarah's. He felt that women should be educated in the fine arts and then marry, have children, and never work outside the home. Women, according to Papa's dictates, were not to have careers of their own. They were to be supportive, even subservient to their husbands. As a teenager, Sarah enjoyed debating Papa on numerous topics, including the role of liberated women in our culture. Often these debates turned into arguments centered on how Sarah would spend the rest of her life. Papa frequently threatened his defiant daughter with the loss of financial support for her college education, dowry, and so forth. In spite of these threats, Sarah left home when she was a young woman. Her papa made good on his promise and withheld all financial support. Yet Sarah never lost her determination to become financially and emotionally independent from her parents. After leaving home, she became a proofreader for a large publishing company. During her career in the publishing industry, she rose to a very senior position. Eventually, she married, but only after her own career was well established. Sarah was distinctly different from her sister, Alice. Unlike Sarah, Alice, a type B housewife, filled the role that Papa had assigned her. She was clearly Papa's girl. Papa's girl married a local gentleman, a fellow from a lower social stratum who had a high propensity to spend but little propensity to earn an income. Yikes. In light of this fact, Papa placed Alice, her low-income producing husband, and their 3 children on his own special brand of financial outpatient care. Papa would never allow his favorite daughter to live in a home or neighborhood that was congruent with his own upper middle class image. He heavily subsidized the purchase of a home and accessories for Alice and her family. Significant cash gifts and gifts of securities were bestowed upon Papa's girl annually. Given these liberal subsidies, one might predict that Papa's girl would have accumulated a considerable amount of wealth. In fact, she and her husband accumulated very little money during all the years that they were on outpatient care. Their budgeting system was quite simple. Spend more than you earn and more than you receive in cash gifts. The balance will be absorbed by Papa. All during this time, Sarah, like many executives, received no outpatient care from Papa. Instead, she was punished for her audacity in violating the strict doctrines Papa had set for her. When Papa passed away, Alice received no more annual outpatient care. Although his favorite daughter did receive the bulk of what was left of the wealth, Sarah received a much smaller amount. How terrible. She was surprised that she received any part of her father's estate, especially since he had told her shortly before his death that she would receive a lot less than his sister. In his mind, his liberated and very independent daughter had much less need for an inheritance than did her sister, a type B housewife. It did not take many years for Alice, the favorite daughter, and her husband to spend nearly all of Papa's money. Shortly thereafter, Alice passed away. How did her children survive? Their own father did not have enough income to maintain their upper middle class lifestyle. Who provided for them? Who paid their college education? None other than their aunt, the recipient of no outpatient care, the semi-disinherited Cinderella Sarah. During all the years her father had supported her sister, Sarah had never hardened or demonstrated any animosity toward Alice. How nice. Sarah never forgot to send a little gift to Alice on her birthdays. She never forgot to send Christmas and birthday presents to Alice's children. Sarah is, in fact, a very successful, independent, compassionate woman. Today, Sarah is a self-made millionaire. She's in charge of her family's finances and is in the process of setting up trusts for her sister's children and future grandchildren. Sarah feels this is important. Regarding Alice's daughter, she told us they know nothing about money. How could they? Their role models were their parents, typical UAWs. Table 6.4. Sarah is a prodigious accumulator of wealth. Even today, she is frugal and very well disciplined as a consumer. Her net worth is many times higher than her annual salary as an executive. Sarah told us, "People would be astonished to know how much money I have accumulated. I know how to hold on to it." Like many wealthy people, Sarah is in the process of subsidizing the incomes of others, the products of under accumulating, over consuming parents. People often ask how offspring of the same parents can differ so much when it comes to accumulating wealth. How could Sarah and her sister be so different? We are convinced that some differences exist at birth. Much of the difference, however, can be explained by variations in how parents relate to each of their children. Papa encouraged Sarah to become a prodigious accumulator while fostering the opposite trait in her sister. In essence, he strengthened the strong daughter while weakening the weaker one. When Sarah left home, she burned her bridges. She received no outpatient subsidies. She had no choice but to learn how to fish for herself, and she taught herself very well. At the same time, her sister became progressively more dependent on Papa and for his money. Sarah had compassion for her parents, particularly Papa. He sacrificed much and worked extremely hard to become an affluent business owner. Papa was determined that his children would not have to work so hard and have to face the risk of doing on their own. But the willingness and ability to work hard, take risks, and sacrifice were the qualities that made him a successful and affluent business owner. Somehow, like many of his peers, he forgot how he became wealthy. Many parents say there is nothing wrong with providing outpatient care. This is true. Perhaps if the recipients are already well disciplined and have demonstrated that they are able to generate a decent living without other people's money. For example, what effect would accepting some outpatient care have had on Sarah once she had taught herself how to succeed, then excel at her chosen field? The answer is probably very little. She was mature enough, strong enough to deal with money, hers or anyone else's. The real tragedy is the helplessness of those who come to depend on outpatient care. Without Aunt Sarah's kindness, her nieces would likely be terrified of the future. Luckily for them, Sarah is helping. Wiser than Papa, she will provide trust for these young women. Such financial support will benefit them much more in the long run than would substantial gifts of cash. Some of the funds in the trust Aunt Sarah is setting up for her nieces are earmarked for education. The rest will not be distributed until these young women demonstrate considerable maturity. Sarah defines maturity as proven ability to earn a good living. It is not her intention to create another generation of weak sisters. Still, Sarah is very realistic about her sister's children. She realizes it is very difficult for teenagers to reorient themselves. It is unclear if her teenage nieces will one day become strong, independent women like their Aunt Sarah. It may be too late. They may have already been too heavily socialized in the consumption independent lifestyle they experienced at home. Fortunately, Sarah is a strong role model. She is confident she can have a positive impact on the behaviors and personalities of her nieces. Moreover, the compassion and love Sarah gives her nieces cannot be measured in dollars. What did Sarah really want from her own Papa? Much more than money. She wanted his love and recognition of her splendid achievements. Today, Sarah has few regrets. She never dwells on the past except when speaking of her father. Although Sarah still feels she was never recognized by her father, she will tell you that she capitalized on this need. Much of Sarah's ambition and drive stems from the need to have her achievements recognized by others. So it is with many Cinderellas who turn some adversity in their early lives into lifetimes of achievement. The unemployed adult child. Like type B housewives, unemployed adult children are significantly more likely to receive annual cash gifts from their parents than their working siblings. In fact, our research findings regarding the incidence as well as the actual dollar amounts of gifts received are likely understated, since about 1 in 4 male children resides with their affluent parents. Oh my goodness. And some respondents did not perceive this living situation as gift giving receiving. Male adult children, by the way, are more than twice as likely to live at home than female adult children. Really. Often the unemployed have a history of being in and out of work. Others are so-called professional students. Typically, their parents view these children as needing the money more than their brothers and sisters do, now and in the future. Thus, the employed are more than twice as likely as their working brothers and sisters to receive inheritances. Often, the adult children in this category have close emotional as well as economic ties to his parent. He is significantly more likely to live in close proximity to his parents, down the street perhaps, or even in the same house. It is not unusual, especially among unemployed adult male children, for the child to act as the household handyman, assistant, or errand boy. The unemployed adult often receives his first cash gift when he shows signs of being unable to maintain or uninterested in maintaining full-time employment. Some young adults who receive substantial cash gifts move back home upon graduation from college or graduate school. Others receive substantial cash gifts for housing, food, clothing, tuition, and transportation. The parents often pay for medical care and health insurance as well. Many of these cash gifts come from overfunded college tuition savings plans. When the adult children decide not to continue their educations, there are often a substantial amount of money that is legally theirs. This money is often used to help them maintain a comfortable lifestyle. Unemployment during the early stages of adulthood is related to unemployment at later stages in life. Many unemployed middle-aged sons and daughters receive direct cash subsidies, often annually. Further, the incidence of unemployment is associated with larger and more frequent gifts. These adult children are also more likely than their brothers and sisters who are employed to receive inheritances in the form of personal real estate. Before and after you're gone. For one of our focus group interviews, we asked a recruiter to supply us with 8 to 10 millionaires for the 3-hour session. All were supposed to be PAs and to have a minimum of $3 million in net worth. We also instructed our recruiter that the millionaires had to be 65 years old or older. Each was to receive $200 for participating. 2 days before our interview, 9 millionaires had been recruited. But on the morning of the interview, our recruiter telephoned to tell us that one of them would not be able to participate. The recruiter said that she would likely be able to find a substitute. Just an hour before the interview, the recruiter telephoned us again to say she had found a 62-year-old recruit. He was a business owner with a high income, but he did not fit the strict definition of a PA. Nevertheless, we agreed to include him. The decision proved fortuitous. The substitute respondent, Mr. Andrews, was not told beforehand that the other respondents were affluent. Perhaps that was why he took the lead in bragging about how he was very well off financially. In reality, Mr. Andrews had a high income but a relatively small net worth. He was a classic UAW who looked and acted the part. He wore gold bracelets on each wrist and had an expensive-looking diamond-encrusted watch and several rings. When Mr. Andrews began telling the group his story, he exuded confidence. But after 3 hours of talking with 8 wiser men, his demeanor changed. His confidence seemed to deteriorate as the interview progressed. We believe Mr. Andrews learned some important lessons that day about financial planning and the intergenerational distribution of wealth. But Mr. Andrews told us that he was already well off and had already achieved his financial goals. But when questioned, he could not articulate his goals. A major part of the plan was to earn high income. He always assumed that most of the other parts of his financial plan would take care of themselves. We have interviewed many UAWs like Mr. Andrews. No matter how we ask them about their financial goals, their responses are predictable. Do you know how many celebrities live in my neighborhood? I make a lot of money. I live 2 houses away from a rock star. My daughter married a guy who earns a tremendous income. What do UAWs such as Mr. Andrews tend to emphasize in telling us about themselves? Their income, consumption habits, and status artifacts. PAs speak of their achievements, such as their scholarship and how they've built their businesses. You will notice that Mr. Andrews, the UAW, has a much different financial orientation than the 8 PAs who participated in our focus group interview. Several of the more senior respondents reflected on their experiences in unusually great detail. We don't think this information would have flowed so easily if it had not been for the initial comments made by Mr. Andrews. His views, so different from the others, prompted an exchange that resulted in the pause providing valuable advice on such issues as gift giving, the role and selection of executors, conflict among heirs, trusts, and the pros and cons of controlling children and grandchildren from the grave. We began our interview by asking, "Would you first tell us something about yourself?" All 9 respondents briefly introduced themselves. A typical response: "I'm Martin. I am married, same wife for 41 years. I have 3 children. One is a physician, one is an attorney, and one is an executive. We have 7 grandchildren. I recently sold my business. I am now active in several religious organizations and 2 that help young people get started in business." All the respondents currently own and manage their own businesses or had recently retired after selling a business. All except Mr. Andrews, who was 62, were in their mid-60s to late 70s. After the respondents briefly introduced themselves, they discussed their financial goals. The first to respond was Mr. Andrews. "Being in business for myself, when I wake up, every day is a challenge. I plan my work. Work is my plan. It's why my business is a good one." Mr. Andrews discussed his current gift giving and how his wealth would be distributed in the future. "I have a son-in-law who is a physician. Another is an attorney. They are well off, high income generators. They are both in the highest tax brackets. They don't need my money. But their wives, my girls, my daughters do. They are spenders. Of course, I have always spoiled them rotten, and I am paying for it now. They call and ask me to pay for their kids' pianos, and I buy pianos. Bicycles and birthday parties, I pay for them too. I enjoy giving them money. My daughters are the beneficiaries of all my life insurance policies, more than enough to take care of all my estate's taxes and expenses. The girls are left with the balance. After I'm gone, it makes no difference to me how they dispose of my money. They can keep it, shoot craps with it, but I just want them to be happy." Happy to Mr. Andrews means having money to spend, and pride is having daughters who are married to high-income generators. He spoke repeatedly about these issues. Seated next to Mr. Andrews was Mr. Russell, a very wealthy, retired gentleman who had recently sold his manufacturing business. Immediately following Mr. Andrews' admission that he spoiled his daughters, Mr. Russell moved forward in his chair and made the following statement: "I have three daughters. All have careers. All are working. All are happy. All live a long way from here. They have their own lives to live. I'm not worried about paying for their futures, nor are they. We don't discuss it. But there will be a large sum, plenty, I'm sure, left over after I pass away." Another respondent, Mr. Joseph, nodded his head and stated, "We have 2 daughters. One is a vice president for a large corporation, and the other is a scientist. We are very proud of them. They will be very well provided for. But as a family, we don't spend much time thinking about my estate." Mr. Russell and Mr. Joseph have the correct formula. If you are wealthy and want your children to become happy and independent adults, minimize discussions and behavior that center on the topic of receiving other people's money. Following these statements, one of the other respondents asked Mr. Andrews about the disposition of his business. His comments generated a series of interesting remarks from the more senior members of the group. Mr. Andrews stated, "All the money I've been making in my business, I dedicate to my daughters and their children. I don't need the money. The kids can use it. I give the maximum within the bounds of the law." What does Mr. Andrews plan to do about ownership of his business? Will he eventually sell it? Will he give it to his children to operate? Or does he have some other idea in mind? "I have an agreement with my oldest son. He is required to pay X amount of dollars each year, and Billy will eventually own the business outright." Several of the more senior respondents question this plan, since this clearly has the potential to create conflicts among Mr. Andrews' children. Mr. Andrews' business is in the service distribution industry. It does not have a great deal of value unless it continues to operate under the Andrews affiliation. In other words, unless Billy Andrews keeps the business operating, there will be no business at all. Asked one respondent, "Would the business have significant value if you placed it for sale today?" Mr. Andrews admitted that it would not. Then why is he requiring his oldest son and key employee to purchase the business? Why not give it to him? Remember, Mr. Andrews gives all of the profits of the business to his daughters. He also plans to give them the revenue he receives from the sale of the business, the money his son Billy pays for the business. Moreover, Mr. Andrews' daughter already receives sizable cash gifts from their father, but not Billy. Billy in his father's estimation, needs no subsidies. He is extremely productive in generating income. He could always carry a great deal on his shoulders. Mr. Andrews feels that his daughters, on the other hand, do not have the ability to maintain an upper middle class lifestyle by themselves. But what about his high income producing son-in-law? In Mr. Andrews' mind, his son-in-law will never generate an income high enough to support the girls' high consumption habits. Also, he told us, you can never fully trust your son-in-law. Divorce is always a possibility. What about future outpatient care for his daughters? Billy, Mr. Andrews' surrogate, will provide the solution for this problem. Mr. Andrews' plan calls for Billy to make payments to his sisters for years after Mr. Andrews' death. No way. The money for these annual payments will come from the profits of his business. Is this unusual? No. Business owners, entrepreneurs, and physicians often find themselves in similar situations. In essence, Billy will be required to heavily subsidize his sister's lifestyle. Oh my gosh. A lifestyle predicated on conspicuous consumption. Mr. Andrews feels fairly certain that Billy will carry out his father's wishes. Perhaps he will, but how would you respond to this plan if you were Billy's wife? Think for a moment. Your husband is paying for his sister's expensive clothing, luxury automobiles, vacations, and so on. Oh my goodness, my wife would not like that. Most spouses feel that charity begins at home. Note that spouses are often the initiators of family conflicts regarding inequities in the distribution of wealth. The other participants did not criticize Mr. Andrews' plan directly. When each spoke, he looked at the group in general, not at Mr. Andrews. Yet it became increasingly clear as the discussion progressed that the other respondents rated the Andrews plan a poor one. One senior respondent reflected on a related situation. Look at table 6.5. Let's see here. One senior respondent reflected on a related situation. As a son grew impatient with his father, the son wanted to take over his father's business, but he did not wish to wait for dad to pass away. So the son opened his own business and actually competed with his father's. Mr. Andrews quickly countered, my son signed a non-compete contract with me. Oh my gosh. Everything in the family is based on trust, isn't it? The participants seemed to think about this statement for a moment. Perhaps Mr. Andrews was having some second thoughts about his plan. Shortly after Mr. Andrews made his comment, he revealed that his children were the executors of his estate. Mr. Harvey then raised his hand and asked if he could respond. We were delighted. Mr. Harvey was the oldest and wealthiest respondent in the group. He began by noting the importance of facilitating harmony among one's heirs. And according to him, the choice of executor of an estate was critical in this regard. Mr. Harvey had served as an executor or co-executor of several estates. He understood full well that being an executor was a difficult task and that there was often animosity among executors and their heirs of estates. For this reason, he had carefully chosen the executors of his estate. I have 2 children. They are close to each other. They can settle my estate between them, but they will do it along with my attorney. The children and my attorney are executors of my estate. I put the attorney in just to keep the balance. You know, when money's involved, what can happen? I want to keep good relations, but good relations may deteriorate at least at the last moment without an experienced professional. Mr. Andrews then spoke. He asked with a hint of challenge, are you really going to use someone from outside the family as an executor? In response, 7 of the 9 participants stated that, in addition to a family member, at least one outsider would be co-executor of their estate. Mr. Ring, a retired entrepreneur and grandfather of 9 grandchildren, was one such participant. Mr. Ring had served as co-executor of several estates. He knew of situations in which the heirs to a grandparent's fortune were seriously spoiled children in their late 20s and 30s who did not have the training, discipline, or ambition to support the affluent lifestyle they had been conditioned to enjoy. Several of these adults still live at home. all had been receiving outpatient care from their grandparents. But, as Mr. Ring explained, once the well ran dry, problems arose. When the grandparents died, the grandchildren and parents became adversaries. Each generation felt it should receive the bulk of the estate's proceeds. These experiences had a profound influence on Mr. Ring. He realized that long before one passes away, one should select professionals to be co-executors. Consequently, over the years, he had developed close relationships with a highly skilled estate attorney and an outstanding tax accountant. Mr. Ring sought their advice before he retired, realizing that someday these professionals would likely act on his behalf to prevent or at least reduce the probability that his grandchildren would battle over his estate. Through the years, he had also sought their counsel on how to give without spoiling. Mr. Ring now gives gifts to his grandchildren, but not in the form of products or social privilege. And he never gives without first gaining the approval and blessing of his grandchildren's parents. The trusts for the grandchildren are controlled. Money is distributed only when each grandchild reaches certain maturity. I was a little against it, but I listened to my lawyer and tax man. I don't want to reach out from the grave to control them, but the way the trusts are set up, my grandchildren will have to work. Mr. Ring's heirs will not begin to receive their inheritances until they approach their 30s. While some affluent grandparents give their grandchildren products and privileges, the Rings give them educations. Such gifts are intended to enhance their grandchildren's discipline, ambitious, and independence. Mr. Graham spoke next. He reflected on his own experiences as a co-executor, which had helped him select co-executors for his own estate. You have to use your judgment. You have to have understanding and compassion. I was an executor of a close friend's estate of a substantial amount of money. I had discretionary power. Every decision was not necessarily dictated. When the daughter, aged 23, was ready to marry, I knew her father would have wanted her to have a nice wedding, so we gave her the kind of wedding he would have given her. After she married and started a family, I was still not quite sure of her maturity, so I distributed only enough money for her to buy a nice home. Later, I was convinced that she was able to take care of herself, so I approved the distribution of what was left in the trust. The daughter received the balance of her inheritance just before her 30th birthday, when Mr. Graham judged her to be capable of handling her inheritance. She had demonstrated her maturity in her stable marriage, role as a mother, and career of her own. When selecting the executors of his own estate, Mr. Graham chose an attorney who was an old friend. He discovered that it's better for the children to be mad at the arbiter man than with each other. Mr. Ward, yet another affluent respondent, had also served as a co-executor. He chose two attorneys as executors of his multi-million-dollar estate rather than his sons or daughters. One of the attorneys was his niece, the other a partner in one of the top law firms in the country. Mr. Ward explains his choices. I chose younger attorneys because I felt that they would have a better understanding of the needs of the heirs of my estate. Both have the greatest integrity and understanding, and the two of them know each other professionally. Beyond understanding, empathy, and integrity, another characteristic was critical to Mr. Ward. The attorney who wrote my will was the one I selected as a co-executor, along with my niece. I felt that if there was a dispute between my sons and sons-in-law, that he would be a good one to arbitrate. That's the reason I selected him. He's been a personal friend for a long time and a very successful businessman. Mr. Ward's comments are congruent with many of our research findings. First, most PAWs have long-term close relationships with several key professionals, such as top attorneys and accountants. Second, many people in Mr. Ward's category have relatives and or close friends who advise them about wills, trusts, estates, and gift giving. In fact, all things being equal, estates in which their heirs, typically the sons and daughters, are professional estate attorneys, tend to be taxed less. Some sons and daughters who are attorneys act as formal and informal legal advisors and opinion leaders for their affluent parents. They have a significant influence over all aspects of estate plans, including the choice of estate attorney, provisions in wills, the ultimate disposition of family assets, the choice of executors, the use of trust services, and the incidence and size of the financial gifts to be given to children and grandchildren. Attorney relatives typically advise their affluent parents on how to minimize estate taxes via annual gift giving to their children and grandchildren. Thus, the mere presence of a son or daughter who is an attorney increases the probability that all the children in the family will receive substantial cash gifts from their parents. Consequently, these children inherit smaller amounts than the norm for all children of the affluent, since much of the wealth in their parents' estates is distributed to the attorney and siblings prior to the death of their parents. What were all of these experienced respondents trying to tell Mr. Andrews? First, that his estate was complex, with many subjective provisions. He had acknowledged that his plan contained numerous verbal promises and monetary commitments. Mr. Andrews needed expert advice in how to handle these complex arrangements. He would be wise to consider having an estate attorney arbiter as a co-executor of his estate. Otherwise, his estate plan could very well become the cause of much conflict and animosity among his children. But what if Mr. Andrews is like many other underaccumulators of wealth we have interviewed? In that case, he is not likely to establish close and long-term working relationships with professionals such as attorneys. Remember that Mr. Andrews stated that he needed no outsiders to help him because I trust my children. It is all based on trust, but trust is not the only element in such situations.